Hey, my name is Beau. I'm a musician and music teacher, and in this video I want to talk about how to build a practice routine. So part of this video was inspired by a jazz musician online named Chad Lefkowitz Brown, or Chad LB. He has a wonderful set of materials for learning jazz, both on his website, and he's got great content on YouTube, so I highly recommend you follow him. He's a monster jazz musician and just a great teacher and a great guy. But anyways, part of this philosophy that I have about building a practice routine was influenced by him, but also some other sources like direct instruction and things like that. So what I would recommend doing when you're building a practice routine is getting away from the idea about thinking about working on the same thing every day. So what a lot of people do is say they have like some technique exercise. They think they have to practice it for 10 or 15 minutes a day. Or say you think, okay, I'm a jazz musician, I gotta be practicing these 2-5-1 progressions in every key every day. Or maybe I'm trying to get, Barry Harris's diminished sixth scale together. And so people, what they do is they think of practice routines in terms of content. So, or if you're a classical musician, I'm working on this Bach piece. I gotta work on it every day until it's done. And that tends to be the natural way that musicians think about organizing things. And, to be fair, it works for some people, and it's a very simple thing to follow. So the benefit of a system like that is you don't really have to track things. You don't really have to think, very deeply. You can just be like, okay, I want to get better at this. I'm just going to do it every day till I'm better at it. And that's totally fine. But what Chad LB talks about, and many people in the educational sphere, Siegfried Engelmann, who was the progenitor of direct instruction, he talked about organizing things a little differently. And so what can be very effective to do, and let's say, for example, I'll do a couple examples. Let's say we're a classical musician versus like a jazz musician, how they can organize things for their practice routine. So what I prefer to do, rather than thinking about content, exact content, and when should I do that content, you want to take a step back and think about larger categories of practice. And so, for example, a classical musician is going to want to do things like get their right hand technique together, maybe left hand technique together. There's probably things they want to learn how to do in terms of repertoire they want to play. They want to learn, Baroque repertoire. They want to be able to sight read. They want to get their rhythm together. They want to get their phrasing together, the ability to perform things. They're going to need to be learning repertoire and memorizing music. And so what we're pulling out here, we're pulling out bigger categories of musical skills. You could call these areas of focus, which is the way that I prefer to frame it. And so the first thing I would do when you're talking about making a practice routine is you need to get this high-level view of like, where do I want to be going as a musician? So again, if I'm a classical guitarist, there's certain things I have to have in place. There's certain skills I need to have musically. I need to be able to audiate, the kind of music I'm playing. If I am planning on being, a professional Bach interpreter, I better be listening to tons of Bach and probably other Baroque music to really get a sense of the musical idiom that I'm working in, the phrasing, the harmonic structures, the rhythmic structures, the forms of the songs. And so that's going to be a key component. And so what you want to do when you're making a practice routine is you want to think about these big buckets or these big areas of focus. I don't have an exact number that you should be shooting for. Probably somewhere between 5 and 9. Something like that, so it can be sight reading, listening to music, right hand technique, left hand technique, harmonic audiation, rhythmic audiation. There's all these things that you can work on. And what you're going to do is you are going to create some kind of organization system. So it can be a Google Doc, it can be something on Evernote, it can just be file folders. I've done this with file folders. It could be a practice notebook if you want to do that. You start compiling individual things that you want to learn in each piece of content, in each area of focus, sorry. So, for example, if I have certain right-hand techniques that I need to learn for the repertoire I'm learning and just for my development, I'm going to start compiling a list. And so, Michael Brecker used to keep, the great jazz musician, he used to keep just like some blank music manuscript and just write down exercises. And he was working with those exercises. And so all I'm recommending is that you keep your own personal catalog of things that you're working on, and however you want to do it is fine. You could keep it digitally, you could keep hard copy just in your practice room, but I recommend organizing this by the area of focus. And so rather than just having you know, a stack of music manuscript paper with a bunch of random things that you're working on. Organize them by area of focus. Okay, here's the harmonic audiation stuff, chord progressions, tonal patterns, stuff that I'm learning. Here are like the scales that I'm learning. Here are the right hand patterns that I'm learning. You don't have to go crazy with this. You could have like 5, 6, 7 categories. Here's the repertoire that I'm learning. For repertoire, I just keep a list. You know, I'm not going to take, I don't keep all the like the photocopies or, you know, music books that I'm learning kind of in a stack. I just keep a list of the repertoire that I'm trying to keep polished and keep in my memory. And so we have these big categories now. And what you're going to do is while you're on YouTube, while you see your teacher, while you're doing whatever, create kind of like an inbox for all this stuff. So this is why this ends up being so effective, because you know you're probably, if you're in this far on YouTube, you know, in the dungeon of YouTube watching this video right now, you're the kind of person that is going all out on music education. You're super interested in stuff. You're probably watching like YouTube videos and TikTok videos with all these different ideas of things you can be practicing. But the question is, are those things actually sticking in your practice? Are those things that you're actually keeping a handle on and learning over time? And so, you know, what I see a lot with musicians is they see something online, they get really into it for a few days, maybe like a week or two, and then it just evaporates. And so that initial practice that they did, it kind of goes nowhere and it doesn't stick with them. And so when we're talking about building a practice routine, you need like a holding pen for all this stuff. And like I said, keep it online if you want, keep a physical copy of it if you want. It doesn't really matter how you literally organize stuff, but you got to start collecting stuff and putting it into these bins. And then what you're going to do in terms of making the practice routine is figure out when you are going to work on this stuff during the week. So you could work on each one of these areas every single day. I tend to not do that. What I tend to do is I'll work on an area for 2 or 3 days straight, and then I'll take the rest of the week off. And so what the practice routine actually ends up being is something like, you know what, I'll actually just pull up what I'm doing today as an example. So in my kind of, you know, on my iPad, the way I represent this, I have a mix of classical and jazz stuff. It's Sunday for me now. So on my Sunday list, I review classical guitar pieces from this certain program that I was learning. And I have some new classical guitar pieces that I'm doing. So I actually separate maintenance of repertoire versus learning new repertoire. I do sight reading on Sunday. I learn Bach pieces on the piano on Sunday. Bach on the piano is just a category for me. Piano's not my main instrument, and so you know it's helpful for me to just study Bach. It's enjoyable. And then I also do some jazz harmony on Sundays, on the piano specifically. And so those are the categories that I'm hitting on Sunday. Now that's actually the same as it was yesterday. So on Saturday and Sunday I do the exact same thing. Now what I'm doing in each of those categories could change day to day and week to week. So this week I'm working on finishing Bach's Invention in F minor, the Invention number 9. So I've been working on that for the past few weeks. And so that's something that I will do when it's time to sit down and practice and I see, oh, it's time to work on Bach pieces Saturday and Sunday. What Bach piece am I working on? I'm working on Bach's F minor Invention. But in the next week or two, I might not be working on that invention, but the category of working on Bach pieces every Saturday, for me it's Saturday, Sunday, Monday right now. I do 3 days a week on that. It keeps coming every week. And there'll be another video on my channel about the power of the spacing effect, but essentially just as a shorthand, you want to space your practice sessions out over time. And so it's way better to do like a few days a week on a couple Bach pieces and then take a few days off, rather than working on Bach pieces for a few weeks straight and then just never playing them again. You need a way to kind of work on something, take a break, work on it again, take a break. Those kind of breaks within the like 3 to 1 week zone are really powerful for learning. They're really wonderful. And so that's what I would actually do. Draft a list of 5 to 10 kind of musical areas of focus. Figure out how many of these you have time to do each day. I like somewhere between like 4 and 5 usually a day. I do a little bit more on the weekends, but somewhere between 4 and 5 a day. And figure out how many days a week. So, for example, repertoire tends to hold a bigger place in my practice scheduling. So I'm usually working on repertoire like 4 days a week, maybe sometimes even 5 days a week for the guitar, which is my main instrument. But things like learning licks or learning harmonic progressions or studying rhythm, I don't necessarily need to do that stuff every day. I don't need to be sight reading every single day to make sure that that skill is growing and to make sure I'm getting better at that skill. Usually something like between 2 and 4 days a week is enough. You want to add breaks in your practice schedule. So, if you're not familiar with this idea of taking breaks or the spacing effect, there should be another video on my channel soon about that. But that's pretty much it. Is that you go areas of focus. Then the next step is get content for this. So what are you specifically going to be learning? And these can be wish list things, so things you want to learn in the future or things you need to learn now. And then draft a list. Grab a maybe grab a whiteboard if you want to start like that. Put the days of the week on this side, and then put what you're going to work on each day of the week. And you don't have to do each thing for an hour a day. You could do 10 or 15 minutes of sight reading every day, or even less. And what this just does is it gives your practice a really strong structure while letting you be flexible enough to kind of add things to the individual buckets and change them over time. And now, you're not going to really see the power of this if you just do this for a week or two. You will see the power of this if you do this for like 2 or 3 months. After 2 or 3 months, you'll be kind of mind blown how much content you are learning, how many skills you're learning, and how much you're able to do, and how simple it is. I mean, and the last thing that I will say before I sign off is that not everything you do has to be tracked like this, So I don't really do this to kind of keep records of what I'm doing. I just do this to keep things organized. But there's lots of times I come, into my music room and I do some practice that has nothing to do with this structure that I've made. Sometimes I'm like, oh, I really want to learn this piece on the guitar, this Barrios piece. Like, oh, I was listening to it and it's really cool. I got to learn it. I just learn it. I mean, I don't necessarily have to wait until I have like, okay, it's a repertoire day. But what this practice structure gives you, it gives you a baseline level of structure that you can always depend on will be there and that you will always be learning. And so, again, if there's extra things I want to do on top of that, I mean, don't stop yourself from learning something you're intrinsically motivated in. But that's kind of how I use this. I have a baseline level of structure, and then I just allow myself to do whatever else I feel like doing. And so, I think in the beginning, depending on where your motivation level is, that will change how hardcore you go. So if you just want a little bit of structure and you're like, hey, what he's saying is kind of interesting, make something like a 15 or 30 minute plan that's going to recur weekly and kind of change daily. So, commit to like 10 to 30 minutes of this kind of structured practice. Allow yourself to do anything else. Now, if you're a professional musician or you really want to squeeze a lot of juice out of it, I mean, schedule like 3 or 4 hours worth of stuff like this, and it's insane how much you can learn. I mean, for me, it's usually somewhere between like 2 and 3 hours, and then I just do extra stuff as I feel like it. So that's a really good way to structure your practice session. And like I was saying before, some of that's inspired by Chad Lefkowitz-Brown, especially the ideas of making musical categories. From what I can recall, he doesn't talk so much about assigning the work to days of the week. That's kind of my own spin on it. But it's very nice. If you live a busy lifestyle, it can be so useful to just like have a little thing on Apple Reminders or whatever you use on your phone, and it just says, hey, today you got to work on classical guitar review, classical guitar new pieces, sight reading, Bach piano, jazz harmony. Those are like your musical objectives today. If you want to do anything else, that's fine. So that's a bit of a crash course on how to set up a practice routine. If you have any questions or comments, happy to answer them. My name is Beau. I offer online piano and guitar lessons. I also offer coaching for musicians and music teachers. So the coaching is kind of interesting. I'm excited about it. It's a lot of fun. The coaching is more so for people who are very dedicated to their instruments. Whether you're intermediate or professional, it doesn't really matter. But I don't need to teach you how to play the saxophone or teach you how to play the classical harp, but you could benefit from maybe getting your productivity act together a little better. You could benefit from figuring out, how do I set up an effective practice session so I get more out of it? How can I complete my musical projects? How can I actually get to like that next stage in my musical career? And it can really help to have someone who's familiar with the coaching side of things, but also the musical side of things. So I've done coaching in the past, and it was some of the best money and time I ever spent. But the coaches that I always saw were never musicians, so they didn't really understand the specific problems I was having. And so having someone with skills in coaching that also has a background as a classical musician or background as a jazz musician, it can just help you plan your project better and follow through on things. Anyways, thanks for joining me today. Have a wonderful day. Until next time.